Welcome. I just want to thank everyone for coming to today's STAR Forum hosted by the Center for International Studies at MIT. We have a very exciting talk today, a book talk with Miko Peled. And before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping items, including for the Q&A, just a reminder to please use the mics because we are videotaping and the only way we can capture the audio is if you do use the mics. Miko will be moderating the Q&A, so I also wanted to remind people that we're just due to time and respect out of others, we can only take questions. And we can only take one question per person, so please respect that. And also, we have, I'll just mention a couple of other STAR forums that we have in the works. We have one coming tomorrow where we will have Shireen El-Feki speaking on her book, which is entitled Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. And then in April, we have a talk, a STAR forum called On the Rocks, China and Japan in the East China Sea. That will be a panel discussion with several Chinese and Japanese security experts. So we have information about these upcoming events outside, and you can also sign up on our STAR Forum email list if you're not already on it. So now I'd like to introduce Miko. Miko Peled is a peace activist who dares to say in public what many choose to deny. Miko was born in Jerusalem in 1961 into a well-known Zionist family. His grandfather, Dr. Abraham Katznelson, please correct me, was a Zionist leader and a signer of Israel's Declaration of Independence. His father, Mati Peled, was a young officer in the 1948 war and a general in the War of 1967 when Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and Sinai. The political became personal for Miko Peled when on September 4th, 1997, his niece, Smadar, 13, was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. He was driven by this tragedy to explore Palestine, its people, and their stories. His book illustrates his journey. He was educated in Israel, Japan, and the United States, and he is an accomplished professional martial artist. Please join me in welcoming Miko Peled.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Okay, good. So before I start, I want to ask a couple of questions. Is anybody here from Israel or Palestine? Okay. Does anybody here have family members there? Okay. Is there anybody here that actually visited the place? Okay. And the last question is there anybody here who couldn't possibly find it on a map? No, everybody can find it on a map? Okay, good. So a lot of you have been there, that's great. One of the most common remarks that I get from people who've read the book is that they get a sense of hope. And probably the biggest compliment I received was from Alice Walker when she agreed to write the foreword for the book. And she said it was one of the most hopeful things she's read on this issue. And this issue of hope, I think, is very important because there's so much bad news and it's such a mostly sad and difficult issue that it's hard to find people who have hope. And I gave a talk a few months ago in front of an 8th grade class. And these 8th graders were 13 years old, took a poll before, they studied the issue a little bit, and then they took a poll among themselves to see how many of them believed that there would be peace in their lifetime. And they're 13 years old. And 80% of them said they didn't think there would be peace in their lifetime. So, of course, a lot of this depends on the information we have at our disposal. And when I spoke to them, I said to them that I'm a lot older than they are, obviously, and but there was no question in my mind that there will be peace in my lifetime. If I didn't feel absolutely certain about that, I wouldn't be doing this. Because what's the point in being an activist if you don't think it's going to happen, if you have no hope? So how many people here think there'll be peace in Israel-Palestine in their lifetime? 2? 3? Okay. How many people think there won't be peace in their lifetime? Wow, okay. All right. Well, well, I asked this question, and a few weeks ago I was speaking somewhere, and a lady in the front said, well, I'm 78, so I'm not sure, how do I respond? And I said, well, the thing is, it's not, having hope doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. Having hope, I think, is having a sense that it's completely possible and realistic. And whether it happens tomorrow or next year, it's hard to say, because that's the nature of these things, that we can't, pin a date on this. And I told her that I think it's perfectly realistic to expect that she will see peace in her lifetime. But this issue is, people like to say, two things that people like to say about this thing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I think are very troubling. One is that it's very complicated. And one is that those people over there have been killing each other for so long that it's really hopeless. And I think both of these statements are wrong. I don't think it's very complicated. I'm not suggesting that it would be easy to get to the solution, but I don't think it's complicated, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And as for those people killing each other for very, very long, forever and ever, those people over there, that's not true either, and we'll talk about that as well. But it's troubling because there are so many myths and there's so much double standard. One example, I think, is of the vast double standard that has been accepted and has become kind of mainstream, is the whole issue of Zionism, or the ideology of Zionism, which is really what created the State of Israel, what drove the creation of the State of Israel, which basically said the Jewish people today, being that they are related to the ancient Hebrews that lived in the region some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, have a right to return. And they use the word return, which is interesting, even though there's not a single Jew in the world that can trace their roots back to the ancient Hebrews. But the word that is used is return. Jews have a right to return. And there's a law of return in Israel, which is a law that allows Jews to come in and become citizens right away, even though they've never been there, their grandparents have never been there, and so on. And you have to wonder how the early Zionists were able to sell this, because when you think about it, it's a pretty absurd notion. But they were able to. They were smart people. They were well dressed. They were all doctors, and they were white, and so it was very easy for them to go to the powers that be and convince them that this was a good idea, especially since the natives were not white, and or weren't considered white. And then when you put that next to another right of return, which is something nobody wants to talk about, or nobody on the Israeli-American West point of view wants to talk about, then that's the right of return of Palestinians. At every serious conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you have to talk about the right of return of the Palestinians. But that's a red line. Israelis won't talk about it. The pro-Israeli groups don't want to talk about it. Nobody wants to put it on the table because that was a long time ago. And Palestinians need to forget. Now, the Palestinians were exiled from their homes over the last 65 years. A great many of them were exiled 65 years ago, but over the last 65 years, there's been that process of forced exile. Many of the Palestinians are still alive. They still have the deeds and the keys to their homes. If their homes were destroyed, they can go among the rubble and they'll find their home in a field. Yet they have to forget. And they're being told by a people whose claim is 3,000 years old that their claim is too old to talk about and they need to forget. And this is something that's been completely accepted into the discourse. This is how the Israeli-Palestinian issue is being discussed. People have accepted these two absurd notions as though this is the reality and this is how it needs to be. So there's no wonder there's so much confusion, because I think rationally people understand that this doesn't make sense, but when you look around you and everybody pretends like it does, then you feel strange expressing your views. I don't, but some people do. Now, there is a word of caution that I'd like to warn you. This presentation is not a balanced presentation. And I know quite often when people come to presentations about this issue, they look for balance. And so I like to put it up, out there as early as possible in this presentation, that if you came expecting to hear a balanced presentation, you're going to be sorely disappointed. This is a decidedly not a balanced presentation. And I don't believe a balanced presentation is possible. If anybody cares enough to stand up in front of a podium, behind a podium and speak, they probably have a pretty clear point of view one way or the other. And for me, like you heard in the introduction, this is a deeply personal issue as well. Growing up, the state of Israel was like my extended family. So this is beyond the issue. This is also very personal for me. But I'd just like to put that out there, particularly if there are people who have strong positive feelings towards the state of Israel. Some of the things I say are extremely difficult to hear. Now, I believe that a good time to start talking about this conflict in terms of how it began is exactly the 29th of November, 1947, which is when the United Nations came up with this map. So the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, and this is the partition resolution, and this is what the map looked like. And even if you knew nothing about the issue, if you look at the map, imagine you were the person that was supposed to go actually on the ground and mark the borders. I mean, look at it. It's an absurd creation. How do you even go on the ground and mark these borders? But beyond that, when we look at what they did with this map, with the partition, the United Nations partitioned the Palestine, and they decided that they were going to give the larger portion of the country to a small group of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, who numbered less than 500,000 people, in order for them to establish a state. And they allocated the smaller portion of the country to the native Palestinian population, who numbered close to 1.5 million, for them to create their state. And to this day, people will say, all of this conflict is all the Palestinians' fault because they rejected this. And you have to wonder, did anybody expect that they would not reject this? Is there anybody who would accept something like this, that the United Nations would come, cut off the larger portion of their country and give it to somebody else? Not to mention a small group of immigrants, mostly immigrants. This was the generation of my grandparents and my parents. And at this point, something very interesting happens. The two narratives diverge. And normally when you have an argument about things, typically you agree on some of the basic facts. And then you argue over analyzing the facts or, understanding them or how to implement things or apply things. Here, the argument is on the basic facts. What happened exactly at that moment or from this moment on? And the story that I was raised on, and the story that people here in the United States and generally in the West are raised on, is that after the Arabs rejected, and we don't say Palestinians typically in Zionist language, we say Arabs. The Arabs rejected the partition plan. They began a massive attack against the Jewish community in an attempt to destroy them and kill them, destroy the community and kill the Jews. And when you learn this in the context of the way Israel typically in the West teach Jewish history, this is one more in a very long line of situations, circumstances where somebody was trying to kill the Jews. So it kind of makes sense. The Nazis were just a few years before that. Now the Arabs, before that there were the Greeks and the Romans, and everybody's always trying to kill us. And so the Arabs are just one more in a long line of people who wanted to kill us, but miraculously we were able to defeat them and establish a Jewish state. And within 12 months, the Jewish state was established, these Arabs were defeated, and so on. And this makes sense because we are the descendants of King David, who beat Goliath. And we are the descendants of the Maccabees, who defeated great empires. So in terms of the narrative, this makes perfect sense. And as you grow up as a child learning this, it's a wonderful story. And you really want to believe that, particularly in my case, when my father was an officer in these Jewish forces, the Zionist forces that fought in 1948. But when we take a closer look at what actually took place at that time and at that place, things look a little bit different. When we look at the two communities, both the Jewish community, that, like I said, numbered less than 500,000, and the Palestinian community, numbered almost 1.5 million, we see two communities that were expecting to become states. So they had institutions of state. And they did everything they could in order to be recognized as a state. But there was one thing that the Jewish community And really, we should call them the Zionist community because these were Jews who followed the call of Zionism to create this Jewish state in Palestine. The Zionist community developed one thing that the Palestinians never did, and that was a militia. It was a fighting force. So by that time, the Zionist militias numbered close to 40,000 very well-trained, well-armed, and very well-indoctrinated young men. And like I said, my father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian militia. There was no Palestinian army. In fact, there never has been a Palestinian army to this day. So who are these Arabs that attacked? Now, we know that the Arab states didn't intervene until much later, till later on, 6, 7 months later. So who are the Arabs that attacked in 1947? Well, there were no Arabs that attacked, because as soon as this resolution was accepted by the United Nations, the Zionist forces began a campaign of terrorizing and ethnic cleansing that lasted 12 months, at the end of which the State of Israel was established. Then later on, when the Arab armies did intervene, they were defeated very easily by the Zionist forces. So now, when we take a look at this picture, what were they able to do in 12 months? They were able to conquer almost 80% of the country. They were able to displace close to 1 million people. And they were able to destroy hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities and villages, some of them as you know, that went back with a history of 1,000 years and more, including, you know, churches and mosques and schools and, of course, homes and everything else. Completely destroy them. And this they were able to do within a 12-month period. But now the story makes sense because there was no opposition, or there was very little opposition. And that's how they were able to do this. Now, one of the things that I do in the book is I go back between the history and the story of the state and the land and its people and in my own family and how they influenced it and how they took part. And there's a story. This is my mother when she was young. And my mother was born and raised in Jerusalem. She's 86 years old now. She still lives in Jerusalem. And this is a story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up. And she was 22 years old. It was 1948. The war was going on. My father was in the front fighting for the cause. And she was already a mother, and she was living with my older siblings in a small apartment with her mother in Jerusalem. Now, when I say Jerusalem, I don't mean the old city of Jerusalem. I mean the neighborhoods that were outside of Jerusalem, what's considered West Jerusalem, and later on became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. And there were many Palestinian neighborhoods there, very well-to-do neighborhoods. In fact, many of those homes are still there. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you see their homes, these homes. They're very distinct neighborhoods and very distinct, beautiful homes. Well, when the Zionist forces came in, they took those neighborhoods, they forced the people into exile, the inhabitants into exile. And these homes were made available for Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. And like I say, I can't remember when she told me this the first time, but I remember hearing it my entire life. And then when I was working on the book, we talked about it more. And she always talks about the story with the exact same emotion. And the way she says it, she says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly move into the home of another mother that now has to raise her family in exile? And then she goes on to describe the loot, how the Zionist forces filled their trucks with loot, furniture, and rugs. And you may have heard rare manuscripts and thousands of books. And how were they not ashamed? And she always expresses a sense of shame having seen these Israelis do this. And she says the story, this is also part of the story, is that when the Israeli forces came in to these homes, the coffee was still warm on the table. In other words, the families had just. Now, what was interesting is that this story always bothered me, and it wasn't until I was actually working on the book that I could reconcile why it was bothering me. The story actually contradicts the national narrative because she's expressing a moral dilemma here. And the way the narrative is, the Israeli narrative, is there is no moral dilemma here at all. Because they attacked us, we won, and they left. So there's no moral dilemma in taking their home. What she's presenting is in a way that we did something wrong. Now, not only is she presenting in a way that we did something wrong, but there's no excuse to it. And typically in Israeli discourse, even when we acknowledge situations where Israel did something wrong, for example, the massacre of Deir Yassin, which was a village in the outskirts of Jerusalem that had surrendered, and the Zionist forces committed a terrible massacre there. And this is acknowledged and this is taught in Israeli school books. But the way this is taught is that Chaim Weizmann, who was later the first president of the State of Israel, said that although the massacre was a terrible thing, thanks to the massacre, thousands of Arabs fled, and this allowed us to become, or to create, a Jewish majority. So even though the massacre was bad, in the end there was a good outcome. And this is typically how we talk about things when we do acknowledge them as Israelis, that we did wrong, there's always a good outcome. There's always something good that happened to us, and so maybe it's not so bad. She didn't do that. There was no excuse, there was no but, it was just we did something wrong, and that's the end of the story. And again, like I said, it bothered me for many, many years. And typically, quite often when I give this talk and I tell this story, Palestinians, especially if they're older Palestinians in the room, they come up to me afterwards and tell me, you know, our parents own one of those homes. And like I said, most of those homes are still there. Now, some of you may have heard the term Nakba. The Nakba is what the Palestinians call the War of 1948. And I remember when I first heard this, I was insulted. The War of 1948 was the war of our independence. This was the war after which the State of Israel was established. How can anybody call such an important historic event a Nakba? Nakba means catastrophe. How can they call it a catastrophe? I understand they don't like it, but a catastrophe. And like I said, I was personally insulted. And over the years, I began to realize and understand and meet Palestinians and kind of my journey into Palestine, which is described in the book, why it's called a catastrophe and why it was a catastrophe. But I think what people don't realize often is that catastrophe wasn't something that happened in 1948. It was something that began in 1948 and is still going on today. This picture, these children in a refugee camp called the Gaza Refugee Camp. It's in Jordan. And I visited recently. And you can see the sewer running through the street, if you can call it a street. The homes, such as they are small and cold. There's no electricity, no running water, no sewage, no health care. They're so poor that they can't afford matches to light a fire to make tea in the winter. And it gets very cold there. It's up in the north. And you have to wonder, this is no more than an hour and a half from Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa. And this is happening today, under our watch. This is a catastrophe. This is a Nakba. That these children have to grow up in these conditions just a few miles away from their parents' and grandparents' homes. This is a catastrophe that's being allowed to go on to this day. And I've never seen such poverty, and I've been to a lot of places, refugee camps and third world countries and so forth. This is inexcusable. This is not some sub-Saharan Africa, days drive or days, flight from other places. This is within hours of the best, the most modern cities within Israel. This is the catastrophe. This is the Nakba. Another example, of course, is Gaza itself. When kids go to school, they go through many homes that look like this. This is a result of an Israeli air raid. And in this particular home, an entire family was killed. I think 13 people were killed. And there are many cases like that, many examples of this in Gaza. I was just there, by the way. And the father and one of the children, just by mistake, were not home at the moment that this happened, so they were saved. And the kids, the next door neighbors, the ones that homes don't look like this, maybe a few houses down, don't know if their house is going to be next. If they go to school and when they come back, will they have a home? Will they have a family? This is a Nakba. This is a catastrophe. It's happening now under our watch every single day. Now, after 1948, this is what the Latin map looked like. Israel conquered, or the Israeli forces conquered almost 80% of the country, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Almost entire Palestine, 80% of Palestine became Israel. And for the Israeli forces, for the commanders like my father, the fact that the West Bank was not included, was not conquered, was not taken, was a very sore subject. And we'll see how that comes to play later on. But for them, there was a big mistake. It was a political decision that the military did not agree to. But this is how it was for 20 years. And then, of course, as I'm sure all of you know, in the spring and summer of 1967, the drums of war were beating. The Egyptian president, Nasser, allowed his forces to go into the Sinai Peninsula, violating the ceasefire agreement between the two countries, and threats of war were being made. And the Israeli High Command decided that this was an opportunity for war, and they need to engage in a preemptive strike. And they tried to convince the Israeli cabinet to allow them to do this. The cabinet was hesitant. And these commanders, the high command, my father was already one of them at that point, these were the young officers of 1948. So these are the ones that remained in the military 20 years later. They're generals, and they're very young generals. They were in their early to mid-40s. And they were very assertive. There wasn't a single battle that they ever lost. And they wanted more, and they were ready for war. And the story that we hear about this war is that once again, Israel was under an existential threat. Once again, Arab armies were intending to destroy it and kill all the Jews. And once again, the Jewish forces, the Israeli forces, were able to defeat the Arabs and increase the size of the state of Israel threefold. And once again, we, the children, the descendants of King David and the descendants of the Maccabees and the descendants of the people who defeated the Arabs in 1948, because it's the exact same narrative, once again, we were victorious. Now, eventually, like it always happens in Israeli politics, the more militant wave always wins. And so, of course, the generals got their way, and they were given permission, they were given the okay to begin a preemptive strike against Egypt. That went on that went very well. It didn't take very long for the Egyptian army to be destroyed. The Sinai Peninsula was taken, and then they went on and took the West Bank and took the Golan Heights. Now, like I said earlier, for the generals, the fact that the West Bank was not included in Israel in 48 was a big mistake. They took the opportunity on their own, by the way, without cabinet approval, took the West Bank, which they, of course, wanted for a long time, like I said, and the Golan Heights, which was an area they wanted to take from Syria for a very long time. Now, what's interesting is this. This is, by the way, a picture of my father, the general. The book is titled The General's Son, and then The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. As I was working on the book, I looked into I went to the Israeli archives to learn about my father's military career. And one of the most interesting aspects these interesting parts were the actual minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the 67 war. They're available. A lot of historians have seen them, written about them, documentaries have been made about that period. It was a very interesting period because of the tension between the cabinet and the generals. And so I wasn't really expecting to see anything I didn't know. But as soon as I began reading those transcripts, those minutes, I saw something my father say, and then some of the other generals said, and that is the Egyptian army was not prepared for war. The Egyptians were advancing an ill-prepared army, that they would need at least 1.5 to 2 years to be really prepared for war, and therefore, we now have an opportunity to destroy the Egyptian army, and that's why we need to engage in a preemptive strike. Not a single word about a threat. In fact, they say we can attack now, or we can attack a month from now, it makes no difference, but we might as well attack now, because we're going to be victorious either way. So what happened to the existential threat? These were the commanders. These were they had the army intelligence. These were the commanders that knew. They were charged with the security. They knew what they were talking about. Not a single word about a threat. And later on, my father and several of the other generals said, admittedly, that this was not a war of defense. This was a war of choice. But it was kind of covered up by the story of the existential threat because it makes for better mythology. And now, once again, the story makes sense. You had a fully prepared army, fully motivated, with a well-planned plan of attack, destroyed the Egyptian army. Then they went on to destroy the Jordanian and Syrian army, was certainly no match for the Israeli army. And within 6 days, they took the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. They destroyed 3 Arab armies, killing more than 15,000 Arab soldiers in 6 days, at a loss of 700 soldiers, Israeli soldiers. Of course, every soldier is somebody's son, so we cry for every soldier that dies, but the difference between 700 and 15,000 is a striking difference. Now, something very interesting happened. As soon as the war was over, the very first meeting of the generals, the high command had, my father stood up and he said, now we have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians and solve the Palestinian issue. He said, we've conquered all this land, we've asserted ourselves beyond any doubt, but we still have another nation here that we need to deal with. If we maintain these territories, if we occupy the West Bank and keep the people within, the Arabs that live there, we're going to become either a binational state, which is not what we fought for, or we're going to become a brutal occupying power. And so that was when the idea of the two-state solution was voiced for the very first time. But as he was saying these things, the state of Israel had already begun destroying towns and cities in the West Bank, expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and beginning a massive campaign of building for Israeli Jews only. This was happening immediately as the the smoke was still in the air. And at that point, he and the Israeli establishment kind of parted ways. And he went on to talk about the need to solve the Palestinian problem, and the state of Israel went on continuing to build and expel and destroy. Basically what happened was this is what the map looked like after the 1967 war. Palestine was erased completely off the map, and the state of Israel took its place, and a very powerful campaign, an unstoppable campaign to integrate the West Bank into the rest of Israel began. And it was a very successful campaign because today the West Bank is fully integrated into Israel. So, the mission was erasing Palestine, and they succeeded. They conquered the land. They engaged in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, just like they did in the other parts of Palestine after 1948. And they began massive building for Israeli Jews only, just like they did after 1948, like I said, integrating the West Bank. So today when people talk about the possibility of Israel allowing the Palestinians to establish a state anywhere within that map, it's a complete misunderstanding and a complete misreading of what Israel is all about and what Zionism is all about. The mission is to take the land of Israel and give it to the Jewish people and get rid of anybody who might be in the way. That's the mission, and that's what it's all about. The possibility of allowing anybody to establish a state within these boundaries is absolutely absurd. Now, there's another issue that takes place, and that is the fact that Palestine was actually an Arab country for 1,500 years until the state of Israel was established. So you have Arab cities and towns and names and monuments and a whole Arab culture that's part of this land, part of this place. So everything has to be destroyed. So cities and towns were destroyed. Names are being changed. Some names are still being changed. And a new history is being created linking today's Israel with the ancient Hebrews, King David, and so on. And one example, there are many examples, but probably the most striking example is taking place in a place called Silwan. If you've been to the old city of Jerusalem, if you know where the Jewish quarter is, you go out the gate and you go down the hill, there's a big community called Silwan. It's a community of over 50,000 people. And someone decided, and it's right just down the hill from the Jewish quarter, and someone decided that under the homes of the people in Silwan is where the true city of David existed. So the homes of the people of Silwan are being destroyed. An archaeological park has already been established called the City of David. Tour buses are already going there. The homes in the periphery of the park are already being destroyed because of the digging, their foundations are being destroyed. And Israeli settlers are taking over homes that are in the farther periphery. So because there are Jewish settlers there, Israeli settlers, you have to have a massive military force there as well. So this is ethnic cleansing, de-Arabizing, and destruction all at the same time. And this is a community of 50,000 people. It's happening in broad daylight right outside the old city of Jerusalem. Tour buses see this every single day. And this is it. This is done under our watch. This is the Nakba. This is the ongoing catastrophe. Nobody cares. Nobody says a word. An entire community of 50,000 people. I live in a city that's less than 30,000 people. I can't imagine here in the United States somebody coming and saying, well, we're going to destroy these homes because, Zeus used to live here. And of course, there is no historical proof that there ever was a King David. And God knows Israeli historians and archaeologists have tried to prove this for a very long time and haven't found a single shred of evidence. But that doesn't matter because the past trumps the present. And what's important is to create this mythology that links Israel, today's Israel, with King David because it's very romantic and it allows Israel to continue to do what it does so well. It's hard to talk about this without the issue of the question of what they call terrorism or the Palestinian resistance. And I talk about this quite a lot in my book. I've interviewed and spoken to many friends of mine, Palestinian friends of mine who are prisoners. And Israel has had and still has thousands and thousands of political prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, in Israeli jails, in violation of international law. Now, a research just came out, an excellent book just came out called Threat. And in this book, they talk about the fact, and it's Israeli and Palestinian writers, over 90% of the Palestinian prisoners have never been charged with violence. So the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails are actually political prisoners. The ones that did engage in armed resistance are a very, very small fraction. So this is important to understand. But of course, Israel and the world calls them terrorists. And I think it's important to realize, especially today, there's so many hunger strikers. In fact, one of them is over 220 days already. Samir Isawi. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of a UN resolution that says that the struggle of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, which I think characterizes Israel very well, for the implementation of their rights to self-determination and independence is legitimate. And I think it's important to say here clearly that the Palestinian resistance is legitimate. Whether we agree with the armed resistance or not, that's another question, but the resistance is a resistance, and it's important to recognize this. These are people who are fighting for their independence and freedom, and this is, of course, in full accordance with the principles of international law. And you cannot talk about, there are two issues you cannot ignore when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. One is the right of return, like I said earlier, and the other one is the prisoners. There's not a Palestinian family in the West Bank and Gaza that has not had a member of its family in prison, in an Israeli jail. And I don't know if has anybody here seen the movie Five Broken Cameras? Okay, if you haven't, you should. It's an excellent movie. It's a very honest it's a very honest depiction of what it's like to resist, of the story of resistance of the town of Bilain. And the things that these guys suffer, the imprisonment, the torture, the beatings, their children, their families, and so forth. So this issue of the Palestinian resistance, I think it's important. Today people talk about Hamas and they talk about the Qassam rockets, of course. And I think unless we understand that this is part of a resistance, that this is a reaction to the brutality of the occupation, of the oppression by Israel, then we're not really making sense, then we're not really talking about the reality. I think it's important to put that in place. And like I said, in the book, I've interviewed and spoken to many, and I kind of tell the story of quite a few Palestinians who were prisoners. Now, at the end of the book, I discuss, it's actually a discussion, it's a conversation about, well, what's next? How do we move beyond this? Because this is really, and why is there hope? And why do I have hope? And why are people feeling that my book is hopeful? The reality is that Israel created one state on all of historic Palestine. It's the Jewish state. The West Bank has been completely integrated with Israel. So you can't delineate the West Bank or any other place anymore and say, okay, that will be a Palestinian state. And this was done by design. This was done by design. Israeli commanders and politicians and prime ministers have said this. The intention is to make the conquest of the West Bank irreversible, to integrate the West Bank fully into Israel. And they have, with highways and schools and big cities and so on. So the reality is that we have a state, but it's a Jewish state. In other words, it only represents half the population, because only half the population are Jewish, or a little bit more than half. You have about 6.5 million Israelis who are Jewish and about 6 million Palestinians who are not Jewish. But it's a Jewish state over the entire country. So everybody's being governed by different laws, which is why Israel is often compared to apartheid. So for me, I'm an Israeli Jew. It's a democracy. It is a Jewish democracy. If you're an Israeli Jew, it's a democracy. I can say what I like. I can come and go as I like. For Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, there are different sets of laws. And there are laws in the law books that specifically discriminate against them. And they live in an entire environment of discrimination and neglect. The Palestinian communities within Israel are so neglected. In some cases, the situation in these communities is worse than it is in Gaza. And then you have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza itself that have absolutely no rights at all. They are at the mercy of the Israeli military. And that military I would categorize as a glorified terrorist organization. So they have commanders and uniforms and tanks and so on, but their main objective is terrorizing a civilian, unarmed population, which is what the Palestinians are. So once again, if we refer back to the Palestinian resistance fighters and to the Israeli soldiers, of which I served in the Israeli army myself, who is really the terrorist? I would claim that I was the terrorist, far more so than any Palestinians in Israeli jails. So we have two nations, we have one state that represents only half of them, but the state controls the entire country. We know for sure, absolutely, Israel has made absolutely clear that partitioning and parting any part of this land in order to create another state will not happen. The only other possibility, the only possibilities that we are faced with is leaving things the way they are, and many people think that that's okay, that this is a war that will never end, but as long as Israel is winning and Israel is strong, that's all that matters. Palestinians can die or whatever, nobody cares. And there's another point of view that says, well, this is wrong. Morally, it's wrong. If we care for justice, this is wrong. And it's unsustainable. 6 million people, 6.5 million people can't control 6 million people like this forever. It's going to fall apart. And that's what I think. Besides being morally wrong, and besides being unjust, it's unsustainable. And when you look at Israeli and Palestinian societies, they're very similar societies. Very high education levels, very high literacy rates. Even Gaza has a literacy rate of over 90%. I don't know if the United States has a literacy of 90%. So you have two societies that are highly educated. Every other person is an engineer, every first person is a doctor, and every third person is a teacher. This is in Gaza too. Most Israelis are actually Arabs because the vast majority of Jews that immigrated to Israel came from Arab countries. So the majority, well, they like to call them Sephardic Jews because we can't say Arab Jews, that's bad. So they call them Sephardic Jews as they all came from Spain. Even though they've never been to Spain, they came from Iraq, centuries, Jewish communities in Iraq for centuries, in Yemen for centuries, in North Africa. But we call them Orientals because that sounds like maybe they came from China or something. But anything but to say that they were Arabs. But the Arab Jews make up the majority of Israelis today. So if the younger generation doesn't speak Arabic, their parents and grandparents speak Arabic and understand Arabic. So really, the vast majority of Israelis are Arabs. And there are areas where already the two societies are mixing because it's inevitable. Hospitals, for example. You see Arab doctors and Arab nurses everywhere in Israeli hospitals. In fact, I have a cousin who's a surgeon. He tells me that some of the most skilled surgeons in Israeli hospitals are the Palestinians who are trained in Amman, Jordan. My mother just had surgery. She's 86. She had surgery. The anesthesiologist and the surgeon were Palestinians. But the thing is that this surgeon that treated my mother so well, when he tries to fly out of Tel Aviv airport, he's treated like a criminal. So he has to go through this process of hours of interrogation, humiliation, strip searches, cavity searches, hours and hours. Every item in his and his wife's and his children's suitcases will be taken out and examined in plain view. And then when all this is done, they're taken by the hand by a 22-year-old to their seat in the plane. Because once they've been sterile, they can't mingle with people anymore, so they can't have a cup of coffee or buy something at duty-free. They have to be taken to the seat on the plane. Now this is unsustainable. This is where it's wrong. So the possibility of a real democracy being established means that the two societies, the two communities can live in peace together and create something new, create something better. It means that it won't be a Jewish state. But the question is of values. Is it worth having a Jewish state knowing full well that it comes with political prisoners, a brutal military force, and racist laws? Because that is the price of having a Jewish state in Palestine, where half the population, like I said, is not Jewish. Or is it better to have a democracy and give everybody an opportunity, and both societies an opportunity, and everybody's children an opportunity to create something better, which they can. If the walls came down tomorrow, they could create a very functioning, productive society, a functioning, productive democracy. But the key ingredient and the missing ingredient today is that democracy, is that the equal rights. So I would argue that anybody who cares for peace and justice in Palestine, anybody who cares for Israelis and Palestinians, that needs to be the focus. Creating a democracy. A real democracy with complete equal rights. A real democratic state. One democratic state for Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you all very much. So I understand if you want questions, just line up behind those mics, and I'll take 3 questions at a time. I'll just write them down. Okay, we'll just go one from each side. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, I agree with you that at this point the West Bank is Swiss cheese, and it can't possibly be a Palestinian state. And what you've laid out is ideal. I have a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of right-wing settlers who are armed in the West Bank and who not only want to keep their settlements but want all of the West Bank for themselves, and how that could actually work, how people could actually be persuaded to create a democratic state of Israel, Palestine. On your thoughts on that?
Okay, thanks. Yes, please.
Excuse me. Thank you. I really would like to share your vision. I think if it were up to the people, the Israeli and the Palestinians themselves, such a thing could happen. I wonder how you factor in the sort of imperialistic policies of U.S. and NATO and that fortress of Israel that is there to protect and to advance those goals. That's where I see the problem of not allowing the people to come together.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just expand the gentleman here's question. It's a fabulous vision, but given Israeli politics, I'd love to have your ideas about how you get from here to there.
Okay, I'll answer these three and then we'll go from there. The settlers are a problem, and I think the settlers are a big problem. I agree with you completely. I think they're one of the most dangerous creations I've ever seen. And if you've been to Hebron or into South Hebron Hills or some of the places where they actually allowed to do their thing, then this is a very dangerous proposition. At the same time, we can't let them always set the tone. Somebody's going to have to set the rule of law and say, okay, well, if you break the law, you're going to jail. The way Israel has treated the settlers, these settlers since the Six-Day War, since 1967, is they always allowed them to kind of be the trailblazers. And then the state of Israel could come and say, well, what are we going to do? They're here, so we're going to allow them to build homes and more homes and expand because they're going to grow, and then they need security and so on and so forth. But the reality is that they're breaking the law and they should be punished, or they should be reined in somehow. I'm not suggesting this is a simple equation, but I am suggesting that if a democracy is established, or I should say when a democracy is established, there will be a rule of law, and there will be people who enforce the law. And if anybody breaks the law, they're going to have to pay the price. They're going to have to be disarmed, just like any other illegal militia, and the law is going to have to deal with them. And it's, like I said, this is one of many problems that the Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to deal with. But they have been allowed to set the tone for too long, and by good design. There was a reason why Israeli governments, both right, left, and center, have allowed them to do this all these years. It was very convenient. But while they are a threat, and many of them are complete psychopaths, there's no question about that, they will have to be reined in by the rule of law, just like anybody else. And I don't think it's a question of persuasion. I think it's a question of applying the rule of law. I don't think they're ever going to be persuaded. That's typically not how it works. How do we factor, U.S. policies? I find that the question of why are U.S. policies so in line with Israel? Why do they let Israel get away with everything? Why do they support Israel so the way they do? And this is the question that puzzles many people. I think it's important to realize that the Israeli lobby has been working in the U.S. and the West for probably 75 or 80 years, way before the State of Israel was established. Like I alluded to earlier when I began, these people who are able to sell this idea that because the Jews are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, they have a right to go back and live there, these were the ancestors of today's AIPAC. They were very good at what they do. The Zionist diplomatic corps was always made of very smart, very educated believers in the cause. And because they were white, and because they were well-dressed, and because they were highly educated, they were all doctors and so on, they were able to sell this bill of goods to the powers that be. And this goes on to this day. So they're able to influence the media, and they're able to influence education systems, and they're able to influence human rights organizations here in the U.S. And this is the reality. And of course, they're able to influence American politics. You cannot have a career in politics in America unless you vote with Israel. Everybody knows that. So I don't think it's so much that the policies are aligned. I think because quite often we take a look and we see that what Israel does is contrary to American policy, or certainly American interests. But because the lobby is so effective, the Israeli lobby is so effective, and you know, the AIPAC is one aspect of it. It's got many tentacles. And they're very good, and they're very efficient, they're very effective, they're very thorough, they're very friendly, so people like them, and it's very easy to like them. This is why, but I don't think the fact that America supports Israel or that American policies somehow look like they are aligned with Israel is a reason to hold the presses and say, well, we can't do anything about this. I don't know if you remember, some of you I'm sure do, a country that was called South Vietnam. And American presidents and American politicians swore that they would never forsake our most important ally in Southeast Asia. And Americans got sick of it. And guess what? There is no South Vietnam. I think if you ask kids in school today, they won't even know that there was a South Vietnam. And there are other examples where American policy seems to be one thing, but other people feel differently, and that changes. So I don't think this is immovable. The fact that Israeli politics are so decidedly right-wing and chauvinistic, and if you've been following the last Israeli elections, you know that if there's anything we can take from the last Israeli elections, the Israelis do not care about the Palestinian issue. As far as they're concerned, this can go on forever. The discourse has become more chauvinistic and more right-wing than it's ever been, and it's always been very right-wing and very chauvinistic, clearly, from the very beginning. But I don't think it's our job to convince them or make them want it. I don't think the whites in South Africa wanted apartheid to end, but they got up one morning and the apartheid was over because people spoke. And I don't think whites in the southern states of the United States wanted, Jim Crow to end, but one day they woke up and it was over. So it's not a question of convincing them, or it's not a question of persuading them or waiting for them to agree. Israeli politics will remain Israeli politics, but the reality is going to be that they will one day wake up and it's going to be over, just like apartheid and Jim Crow and other racist ideas and racist regimes had to make way for something better. Okay, please, go ahead.
It's a terrific talk with a lot of important points. But speaking as a general's son, has the IDF lost some of its mystique of invincibility? They were forced to accept a truce in November with Hamas, which many saw as being somewhat humiliating, and as they backed down on their part. They were unable to defeat Hezbollah in their invasion of Lebanon in 2006. They were forced to unilaterally withdraw from southern Lebanon in 2000 and from Gaza after that.
Yeah.
They've been ruling mainly through the deterrent power of fear and intimidation, and it appears that the resistance is increasingly emboldened in feeling that they're no longer quite unbeatable. So is this new psychology that's creeping in both to the IDF and to the resistance movement, creating a kind of tide change within both sides? And what good is a standing army of over 500,000 in an era of asymmetrical warfare anyway? What is the future role of the IDF as you see it?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Sir, in the movie The Gatekeepers, one of the former Shin Bet directors talked of a plot by some Israelis to blow up the Blue Mosque. In the event such a plot would come about and be successful, is there any resolution by Israel, either by itself or in a coalition with any other countries, to rebuild the mosque if such a thing happens, either because of war or earthquake or sabotage? What would happen if it were destroyed by any of those possibilities, and how would it affect facts on the ground, both for the Arab Israelis and the Jewish Israelis?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Salam Odi. I was born and raised as a Palestinian refugee in Jordan. my father was a heavy mechanical engineer in the Jordanian army, so I was not born in a refugee camp, but I have visited refugee camps in Jordan. And my question to you, I know you have mentioned that there is a lot of the Israelis there, or the Jewish people, or Arabs. I know I go and I visit, and thank God I became an American citizen, and that's the only way I can go and visit my family's home in Nablus and visit most of my aunts and uncles. And I have lost, my aunt was shot and killed in 1989 in the first Intifada, so was my uncle. So, I have lost loved ones, but I have never met in all my visits like much of Arab Jewish. As a matter of fact, the only Arab Jewish that I have met and I became friends with, it's the Samara. And those are the people who live in Nablus, and they don't even recognize Israel. For me, I have no hope because of what you just had explained. Those Europeans, most of the Jewish that I have seen and the Israelis on checkpoints are either from Africa or either from Russia, really. And I have no clue how is the hell we end up from, or from even Vietnam. I was there 2011 and I was not allowed to pray in Al-Aqsa, even though my aunts, of course, I was told, I'm in my 30s, so I can't go in. I have to be 50 plus. So how could we have hope when the killing it's absolutely ongoing, whether in Gaza, whether in the West Bank, all over the place. And the hunger strike, I have no clue why even the U.S. suspends, why the American people are still sleeping. We have a private, like people here really going without health care and going without even like money for education. It's really terrible. Yet we can afford to support Israel by $8 million a day. I have no idea. I think if the American people would wake up and smell the coffee, I think there will be I don't think there will be much of Israel. Thank you.
Okay, we can take one more.
I guess my question would deal primarily with the BDS movement. In terms of whether or not you think it is effective and will, if we continue to support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and how some Israelis may support this.
Okay, thank you. All right. Has the IDF lost its invincibility? Without a doubt. But most of the victories, all the victories the IDF has ever had were against enemies that couldn't fight back. In 1948 they fought a civilian population. In 1956 they fought, together with the French and the British and defeated the Egyptian army. It was a very easy battle. Within 5 days it was over. 1967 was the same thing. The only time that the Israeli army was caught, caught with its pants down, so to speak, is 1973. The Arab armies were planned something and prepared it well, and the Israeli forces were not prepared, and they got beaten very badly. And then after that, Lebanon and so on and so forth. But whenever the Israeli forces are actually faced with a serious contender, with a serious adversary, they get beat. In Hezbollah in 2006, you're right, they got beat very bad. Israelis' best units, top elite forces, ran out of southern Lebanon with tails between their legs. And Hamas is emboldened. Like I said, I was in Gaza, by the way. I had to go in through a tunnel because I can't go in through Israel, and the Egyptians, of course, are unpredictable. But people in Gaza are emboldened by the Qassam brigades, without any doubt, because the IDF, the Israeli military, with all of its bombings and all of the destruction, killed civilians. They barely touched the Qassam brigades, and so of course they're emboldened. And the other side of that is the question that's being asked in Gaza and other places is, why is Israel not giving the Palestinians any other option but the armed resistance? I don't know if you paid attention. Khaled Mash'al was in Gaza, I think it was December, and he gave a major speech, and this was one of his points. He said, "We're not fighting the Jews to kill Jews. We're fighting the Zionists because our land has been occupied. And why are they not giving us any other option but the armed resistance?" Well, I think the answer to that is quite clear. So there's no question that the IDF is I don't know if it become invincible without it. I mean, lost its invincibility. And again, I don't know that it was invincible. It was just a very well-trained, well-prepared army that was facing armies that were in shambles or populations that had no military force. And the future of the IDF, I would hope that at least the commanders would face the International Criminal Court for their war crimes. And they would dissolve it just like any other terrorist organization. And if this new democracy, when it's created, if there's a decision to, establish a military force, they'll have a military force like a normal democracy. I don't know why they would need one, but let's say they decide to have one because of whatever reasons, then that's what they'll have to do. But I think the IDF today is no more than a terrorist organization and has to be treated that way. And Gatekeepers, I'm glad you brought it. Who saw Gatekeepers? Okay, I don't think it's a very good movie. I saw it. I think it's a propaganda movie. It's a very poor Israeli propaganda movie. It portrays these 5 men who were the heads of the Shabak, the Israeli. It's called the Internal Security Service or secret police, which is something only, dark, brutal regimes have. And of course, Jews don't have to deal with it. It's only the Shin Bet only, the Shabak only works against the Palestinians. In fact, at the end, somebody asks one of them, the reporter asks one of them, has Israel become a Shabak state or like a police state? And he said, oh, no, I don't think so. Well, if you're an Israeli Jew, that's true. But if you're a Palestinian, then the Shabak has governed your life because every permit you need, every driver's license you need, everybody that has a job, a government job, and I'm talking about Israeli citizens, Palestinians or Israeli citizens, a principal of a school, anything. They need to get an okay from Shabak, and if they don't agree to cooperate and they don't agree to become collaborators, then they suffer. And this has been the reality. So these 5 men who should be the first ones sent to the International Criminal Court because they ruled an organization that was charged with torture and murder and abuses, human rights abuses that we can't even begin to talk about here, are suddenly hailed as heroes because they said that 1 or 2 things they did was wrong. But if you listen to their words, you see how the pleasure with which they describe the horrors that they committed, you realize that these men are sick and need to be in jail. They're dangerous men. As for the question, I don't know that there's any plan what to do if the mosque is destroyed. I think it'd be a terrible loss. I think besides being a catastrophe politically, it would be a terrible loss. I think it's a beautiful monument. It's a religious. It's a religious monument that's been there for many years. It's one of the symbols of Jerusalem today, and I think that would be a terrible thing. I don't know that there is any plan to rebuild it or what to do if something like that were to happen. Okay, so you had a long comment, and you're absolutely right about everything you said. The only thing I take exception is the hope, because all the things you described are happening today. The hope is believing that one day we can change this. And if we don't think we can change this, we never will, which is why I think hope is important. Now, how do you find hope? When you say you don't find these Arab Jews, well, the reality is that most Israelis are descendants of Arab Jews. Today, the thing that we have to realize is that Israel really kidnapped this notion of Jews. And you have to differentiate between what it means to be Jewish, which is very broad, and what it means to be Zionist and support the state of Israel, which is very narrow. And Israel kidnapped Judaism, although there's really nothing Jewish about Zionism. There's nothing Jewish about the idea, like I said earlier, of bringing Jews to Palestine. In fact, most Jews rejected it. Even after the Holocaust, the state of Israel was established a few years after the Holocaust. Most Jews opted not to go there. And after the state of Israel was created, years into the mid-1950s, they didn't know what to do because Jews were not coming. Jews were not coming. After the Holocaust, survivors opted to go back to Europe or come to America or go to places where everybody's safe. Not only Jews, because this notion of going and capturing an Arab country and living there seemed absurd to them, or for whatever other reasons. But the reality is that most Jews have never accepted Zionism, have never accepted the state of Israel. Now, we do have communities here in the United States and basically in the West everywhere that have become Zionist, that are Zionist communities. And they're really part of this, they're one tentacle of this Israeli lobby. And they fly the Israeli flag, and they go to the AIPAC fundraisers and so on and so forth. But they do not represent, certainly they don't represent the Jews in America. They are one aspect of the Jewish community in America. I speak everywhere now. And half the organizers that invite me to speak are American Jews. Half the audiences I speak to are American Jews that do not accept the state of Israel, that do not accept Zionism. Are they less Jewish than the ones who dance around when Israel is bombing Gaza? They're very different people. And I think it's an important distinction to make. And I would argue that Israel is not really a Jewish state. It's just a state that favors Jews, that discriminates favorably toward Jews and discriminates against anybody who's not Jewish. But that's what Israel is, because most Jews don't live there and will probably never go there. But I do think there's hope, because I think, just like, if you talk to people a year or 2 years before apartheid in South Africa fell, and I was in Connecticut, and I was talking to a group of people, I didn't know that the state of Connecticut actually had a resolution to divest from South Africa. And they passed it. I mean, it was a lot of hard work, but they actually passed it. But when they were doing it, they didn't think apartheid was going to fall. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do, because you had to divest, you had to apply pressure, and that goes to the BDS question as well. And that's how it worked. Eventually, apartheid fell. But I think there are a lot of parallels here, and I think it's important to see that. So I think it's important to act in order to bring about the change and to see exactly what it looks like. And you can see this. There are areas where you can see Israelis and Palestinians working very well together. And I think, like I said earlier, it's inevitable. So we have to envision what this future is going to look like, and then work hard to accomplish it, because I think there is hope. In the USAID, you're absolutely right. Americans are probably, we know that Americans pay more money to Israel than any other country in the world, any other people in the world, yet they're the least informed people about this issue. And of course, there may be a connection there, between their willingness to pay and their ignorance on the issues. But when Americans know, and I don't think it should be if Americans know, I think the question should be when Americans know, and it's going to be thanks to things like this, although usually I have bigger audiences, but thanks to things like this, that Americans learn about these issues. And they are learning. If you go to campuses, I'm sure this campus too, although I'm not familiar with MIT, there are Students for Justice in Palestine. It began as a small organization in a few campuses 5-6 years ago. Today there are hundreds of them everywhere, all over North America. And the next few weeks they're going to be holding Israeli Apartheid Week. And in fact, tonight I'm going to Brandeis right after this to speak at their event, and other campuses. There are 5-6 campuses over the next week that I'll be speaking at. And this is what they do. And thousands of students are exposed to this. And so this is how change happens, when people talk about it and make others aware of it, And like I was telling to people in Connecticut last night, I said, well, you guys did it with South Africa. Why not start a campaign to do it with Israel? You see a few lights a few eyes become bright. Yeah, there's a struggle. We might not win, but it's certainly worth beginning and starting this conversation and starting the effort. If for no other reason, just to see the Israeli lobby jump up and down, which they surely will. Now, the BDS, going back to the BDS, I think the BDS has proved itself already with South Africa. And the BDS has, certainly trade with the U.S., between Israel and the U.S. is huge. But at the same time, the BDS has some very clear victories. And I think what's more important is the BDS, it's the right thing to do without a question. It's the right campaign, it's the right people. These are principled people. These are people who have set very clear goals to what it is they're trying to accomplish. They're following the example of the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And there are symbolic things like, last December, Stevie Wonder pulled out of a big fundraiser in LA for the IDF, for the Israeli military. That's huge. That's a huge insult. They still raised $14 million that night. But at least they didn't have Stevie Wonder, and the world knows that Stevie Wonder pulled out. And in many cases, like academics being boycotted or boycotting Israel and performers. And then there are actual companies, several campuses around the U.S. have already had passed divestment resolutions. University of California, University of Toronto, I think, a couple of campuses and so on. So this is something that's going on and is only growing. So definitely I think the BDS is the right way to go, and I know the people and I respect them, and I think they're fighting the right fight. Okay, let's do 3 more.
Yes, so you envision clearly a just one state solution, and that's what I think we all want. But in my Orthodox family and in the power structure within Israel, they know it's not sustainable. So they probably want one state under the cover of ethnic cleansing or another war. And I do see that there has been a shift in consciousness in the U.S. And maybe even Israel. But the concern I have is if you look at the history of Zionism, it's always been extremism that has won out. So political assassination, covert operations. So I was wondering if you could speak to how we can blunt that from taking the helm again. And I referenced Lavon Affair, 1967, USS Liberty, just things like that. So yeah, if you could speak to preventing that.
Okay, thank you.
My question is about the American media. I live on Cape Cod, and the Cape Cod Times 5 or 6 years ago, maybe every third or fourth letter that I would send, I might get one of them published. And they would always delete the 3.1 billion if I put that number in there, because they don't want people to know what we're spending. So all of a sudden, I've noticed in the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, that Cape Cod Times is publishing almost all of my letters, and the 3.1 is staying in there. And I find that to be an amazing thing. And I don't know if that's just Cape Cod or what, but I think we are changing. And also, so I'm wondering if that's something that's just a regional thing, or if that's something across the country where they're starting to be more open, where publishers are being more open about what they will publish. And then the other question I have is about the media. I just recently cut the cable umbilical cord, and I got myself satellite TV, which you can get Al Jazeera on Link TV, which all of the satellite television programs provide Link TV, which has lots of documentaries, which are the kind of documentaries that AIPAC would never approve of. And I was amazed when I first saw Al Jazeera 5 or 6 years ago in Germany, because there was only 3 English-speaking channels on the television that I was watching, so Al Jazeera was one of them. I think, they're not at all unbalanced. They make Fox look so unbalanced in comparison. Al Jazeera was wonderful. And I said, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could get that? And we can now. And I think if Americans knew that they can get Al Jazeera, they can get Link TV, they can get, it's a good thing. And I just wonder if you could comment if that's something across the country you're seeing a change in the media or what.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that you take that lady's question because she was waiting in line before I got to this mic.
Well, it's sort of a follow-up. I don't think the media gives us the information that we need. For instance, that since the November ceasefire, there's been 4 deaths in Gaza directly related to the use of that boundary area, and they continue to harass the fishermen so that they're not allowing them into that 6 nautical mile area. But we're not learning about it. We have to get our information from Palestine Today by internet. I write to my senator, who's Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, and get no response, or if I get a response, it has nothing to do with anything I said to her. I wondered if you have had any one-to-one contact with your representatives or senators, and if you're more successful. And I also wonder if you have any hope for Hagel as Defense Secretary, if now that he's in that position, if he'll be able to be more brave.
Shall I go ahead and toss mine in to the mix?
Go ahead.
Well, just for information, since politicians were mentioned, Ed Markey is likely to be the next senator from Massachusetts, judging from polling and other observations. I remember Ed Markey saying to me once, he was a keynote speaker at a conference here on disarmament. He's considered to be quite good on nuclear weapons issues. And afterwards in the lobby, this was at the time when Israel removed some of the settlements from Gaza. And there was a big hue and cry about all the suffering, the terrible suffering of the people, the settlers, and all that they went through. And I mentioned the matter of Israel and Palestine to him in a rather sort of vague way. And he got very it went through incredible histrionics about the terrible, terrible suffering of the settlers in Gaza, and how could anybody say anything like this? So he's big time into Israel, and I think it's worth thinking about that when people consider, how wonderful it is going to have to have Markey in there as the next senator. My question for you is, because I understand you didn't address this, I think people in this country, we get to be in varying degrees of involvement with these issues. We get to be experts, some of us, on all the different people who come from Israel are involved with this issue, whether it's Jeff Halper, or whether it's Yuri Avneri, or, we hear all of the people who are in opposition in Israel. What is the level of receptivity in Israel among Israeli Jews to these ideas? Because my understanding is it's not very large. I mean, I obviously wish it were larger, but.
Okay, we have two more and that's it? Okay, I'll take your guys and then we'll, go from there. So go ahead.
I'm going to bring up a topic that may be unwelcome or a little too hot, but let me just throw it out.
What could be possibly too hot for this conversation?
Who's Well, it's the issue of Israel's involvement, or Mossad's involvement in 9/11. And some of the people who have touched on it who are presumably in a position to know and who are Jewish. And the more frightening thing is that the people who had the chutzpah to do that might do something worse. And there's talk of some of these Broken Arrow, if you will, lost nuclear weapons. And if terrorist activities aren't enough to totally terrorize the American public, something more horrible happening might be. And I just don't know if is it best to get the people responsible for 9/11 really dragged out and prosecuted, or not? Is that going to be necessary to stop things, or is there going to be a horrible backlash against a whole very innocent bunch of very good people who don't deserve the backlash?
Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, trying to understand. I think I understand part of your views, but I don't know. Are you saying there was no Judea and Samaria?
I'm sorry?
Are you saying there was no Judea and Samaria?
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, it's...
Okay. Okay, we had a lot of questions. You're right. The first question was about the methods Zionists use to accomplish their goals. The very brutal and extremist. But this is who they are. And if we look at brutal dictatorships in South America, if we look at fascism in Spain and in Greece, I mean, some of us are old enough to where we remember this. The fall of these regimes. Not to mention a gentleman by the name of Hosni Mubarak, who was thrown out of his seat by a popular revolution. And if you would suggest that was a possibility a year before it happened, you would be sent straight to an asylum. Because Mubarak was like the pharaoh. He was not going anywhere. His son was getting ready to take over. So all of these very brutal regimes, even with their brutality, even with their assassinations, even when they, and Israel certainly has assassinated clergymen and intellectuals and political leaders across the board, Palestinians, of course. But these regimes can be brought down. Apartheid in South Africa is certainly another example, and there are others. So even with this, and this is similar to the question about the settlers, the real hardcore extreme settlers, were really, kind of a Jewish version of the Taliban or something. But even these people can be hauled into jail and brought and brought down. And I think this has to be the name of the game. That's why I say anybody who cares for peace and justice has to make the one democracy and equal rights their banner. That has to be the banner, because that answers all of these other questions. People still talk about the two-state solution as though it was realistic. I think the two-state solution is a fig leaf that allows Israel to continue to do what it's doing. But there are some people who truly believe, who really think this is a good idea. This solves nothing. There are so many different issues that have to be resolved, and the only answer to all of these is a real democracy with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians in one state.
What about as a transition? Or two-state, which is what Noam Chomsky recently...
Yeah, well, that's not going to happen because that assumes that you could have a state of Israel that will agree to this. The only way this is going to happen is you have to bring the end to the state of Israel. It's like saying, well, we're not going to get rid of apartheid in South Africa. We're going to carve off a little bit, get rid of apartheid a little bit over here, and then if they behave well, we'll take off a little bit of a... There is no Israeli government that will ever allow this. The only way this is going to happen is when there's no Israeli government, there's no Zionist state. Then you can talk, because they won't be a partner to peace. The Zionist state, the state of Israel, has made it absolutely clear that they will not be a partner to peace, period. The only thing they're ever willing to do is to sign an agreement with the Palestinians that was a surrender agreement, which is what Oslo was, which is why it's failed. Oslo was an attempt to get the Palestinians to get Yasser Arafat to sign a surrender agreement. And when he didn't do it, they said, well, he's not willing to make concessions. He wants to kill Jews. He'd already given up 80% of Palestine for the two-state solution. And he's making peace with a country who destroyed Palestine and won't allow the Palestinians to return to their homeland. The state of Israel is not a partner to peace. They made it absolutely clear. The most reaching out cabinet there ever was, with Rabin in Paris and so on, they made it absolutely clear that there were three things they would not negotiate. They had three no's. No to the Jordan River Valley, no to the expanded boundaries of Jerusalem, and no to the major settlement blocks. You know what that means? No Palestinian state, because these three make up most of the West Bank. And this is the most peace-leaning government Israel has ever had. So Israel cannot be a partner to this. Not in a transitionary way, not in any other way. You can't have just a little, it's like a pregnancy. You can't have a little pregnancy. You either have a racist regime or you have a democracy. You either have a racist regime or you have a democracy. You can't have a little bit of both. And Israel is a racist regime, and therefore it's not working, therefore it has to go. And that's exactly how it has to be. It's like with apartheid. You have to get rid of apartheid. You have to get rid of Jim Crow. You have to get rid of racism, period. And then you can move forward. Thank you. And then you can move forward beyond that. And it has been done. And it has been done. And Israel didn't invent all these methods. You're absolutely right about the demonic use of the Shabak and so forth and their methods. But they didn't invent this. And other regimes that were like that were brought down by serious popular grassroots resistance. And again, I say this again, it has to be that people who are on the side of peace and justice, and again, some people think that what's going on is fine and should stay that way. This is a question of values. But if your values determine that you believe in peace and justice and so forth, then a democracy is the only thing that's available, because the other option is this. There is no third option. It's either racism with Israel or a democracy without Israel, and that's the way it is. And nobody's talking about genocide, and nobody's talking about killing Jews. That's all a bunch of nonsense. We're talking about a transition from a non-democratic state to a democracy, to include more people in the system, in the process, in the political process. That's what we're talking about. And again, I'm not suggesting this is going to be a walk in the park. I'm not suggesting this is going to be a tough, excruciatingly difficult uphill battle. The Israeli army is not going to roll over and die. The state of Israel is not going to roll over and die. The Zionist propaganda machine here in the U.S., AIPAC, and their all their tentacles are not just going to. I mean, they're running out of excuses, but they're still going to jump up and down. They've got a lot of resources. And if you're not Jewish, you're going to be called an anti-Semitic, even though there's nothing Jewish about Israel, so there's nothing anti-Semitic about opposing it. And if you're a Jew, they're going to call you all kinds of stupid names. But the point is this. If you're not Jewish, and criticizing Israel means that you're anti-Semitic, what do you call somebody then who supports Israel? If it's anti-Semitism to oppose Israel, to oppose racism, if it's anti-Semitism to oppose this brutal regime, if it's anti-Semitism to oppose a state that has thousands of political prisoners, what do you call a person who supports all these things? A good Semite? A good Samaritan? What? What is the name that you go by when you like these things, when you support these things, when you give a brutal regime like that all that money? Amen. So these are the things I think that we need to cover. I think Michelle is coming to give me the hook. So I'll go quickly over these The U.S. media, I tend to see some shift, but I don't think it's dramatic, and I don't think it's enough. By the way, if you want to get all those stations that she was talking about, just go to livestation.com. It's a website. It's free. You get everything. You get everything: Al Jazeera, Russian TV, BBC, Sky News, France. I mean, anybody you want, and they all have channels in English, Arabic, and their own language. Livestation.com. It's free. It's very good. And if you really want news and documentaries and so on, that's the place to go. Israel is not receptive at all to any of the peace activists, at all. I mean, we represent a small fraction of a percent. Having said that, one thing I need to acknowledge, and I want to acknowledge here, are the refuseniks. There are several thousand of Israelis who refuse to go and serve in the Israeli military, and they go to jail. Now, you have to consider this. It's very easy to get out of the draft in Israel today. It's very easy. If you have a back pain, you miss your mommy, you have asthma, it's because they don't want people. It's too big. They don't need. So only about half the people actually go in. The only thing you're going to go to jail for is if you say you're a conscientious objector. And these kids, boys and girls, men and women, 18 years old, admit that they're conscientious objectors, that they refuse on moral grounds, and they go to jail. And there's several thousands of them. So it's still a fraction of a fraction. And Israelis are not receptive to this at all. I mean, a few people are, but not by and large. And again, I don't think whites in South Africa were receptive to the anti-apartheid movement either. So I don't think that's not either here nor there. I can't speak to 9/11 because I don't know. I hear this come up every time, but I can't speak to it. I don't know. Who do we prosecute? I think clearly we need to prosecute people like George Bush and Rumsfeld for what they did in Iraq. So, and Cheney and so forth, these guys have to be prosecuted for war crimes without a doubt. And I hate to say this, but Barack Obama as well, for what they do in Afghanistan and Yemen and so forth. So there's plenty of people to prosecute if we ever get to that day. And the last question, Judea and Samaria, that's what Jewish people call the West Bank, I suppose, Judea and Samaria. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for coming. And if you'd like the book, I think they have copies outside. I'd be happy to sign them.
Yes, I wanted to remind everyone we're selling books, and Miko will be signing them as well. So please, if you haven't bought a copy yet and read it, please do. Thank you.